welcome back to how to build a modular layout from start to finish. In today's video we are covering how to lay track, and we're talking about mostly track on curves because that's the most complex track laying steps you can have on a layout. The straight track is very simple and very straightforward. You simply lay it out and it's already straight for you. You have to do a little bit of adjusting, but the curve track is really where you can encounter some problems and is much more complicated and hard to figure out. So with that said, let's get started on how to build a modular layout from start to finish track laying right now. Let me just start by saying that actually trimming this flex track and soldering joints is hard, especially when you use the weathered microengineering flex track. It has a lot of positives, but one of the issues with it is that you have to actually file off the weathering wherever the soldering point is going to be. So you actually have to get that clear and down to bare metal, or the solder will not adhere and your joint will pull apart. Also on the curves, you want to actually solder the two connections while your curve is in a straight formation before you actually start to curve it. So you can see this is curved off, but over here you're going to want to solder these joints straight before continuing the curve. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and line this up. I'm offsetting the solder joints. Some people say it's required, some people say it isn't required for larger curves. I'm going to do it anyway. I've been offsetting about 15 to 18 ties. So I'm going to count 18 of these ties, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut them off and offset the joint. So I've got it overlapping about 18 ties. Now I'm going to cut this side here with my rail cutters. These are Xuron rail cutters. And then I'm going to take some rail grabbers. I'm going to slide this out of the ties. This is basically a way to offset the solder points. Now the reason you're offsetting the solder points is to prevent any kinks in the rail. Now you're probably preventing kinks in the rail just by soldering on the straights, but you can additionally prevent any issues with your track by actually offsetting the points. So this will be one connection, and then over here will be the other connection. So I've got to line this up. You can use your rail snippers to mark if you don't have a pin, especially on the weathered track. It makes it really easy to mark. I'm going to snip that. Now keep in mind, you want to keep this rail in place. So we're now going to slide all the ties off while keeping the rail on the other side. So what you have is a nice, oops, sometimes the ties are connected. So you slide that off, now you have a nice offset piece. Now before you actually do anything, you've got to work on a couple other pieces. You're going to have to clear out a couple ties, so you have space for your connection. This is a soldering iron. You don't want to burn ties, get plastic on your soldering iron. So you're going to make plenty of space for your connection. You see here there's a gap of about 4 ties. On this end, we'll probably cut off a couple more ties. You save these ties because you're going to sand them down, slide them back under later on. Now we have two pieces that butt up against each other. You're good to go there. But again, you can't skip the soldering because you have to take off the weathered effect on the rail. I'm going to really zoom in here so you can see how close you need to be, how much you have to take off in order for to get the solder to stick. So I've made this piece of rail here so you can see what's going on. You see the weathered portion, and then you see the shiny part. That's where I filed away the weathered portion. You're going to want to file away any area of the rail that's going to be in contact with solder. That's the bottoms, the side of the rail, inside both sides in case the solder feeds through. You really only want to solder the outside. Then you're going to want to solder the end flat and angle each rail just to take out any burrs. So obviously I'm doing an abbreviated version here, but just a quick angle inside, bottom, and end. Now this is not as easy as it seems. For the video I'm trying to save some time. It did frustrate me to a certain level, but once you're done soldering all 4 contact points, then you can move on to the actual rail joiners. Now that you have everything filed down, everything's flat, bottom, sides, all that jazz, you're simply going to take rail joiners, snip them off here. I use the rail snippers from Xuron. Now these are actually in scale code 80 rail joiners. They save you a few bucks over the micro engineering rail joiners. Then all you're going to do is slide it into place. Obviously I slid the rail through here. Now I've been doing all this over my river section. The river section is going to come out anyway, so putting all the indentations, the track indentations, all this jazz doesn't really matter because it's all coming out. I'm going to be cutting that out, so I would suggest if you're doing this, don't do it on foam normally, but that's why I don't mind putting all these indentations in. So now the track is offset. I've got a few more ties than I would like out, but you're probably going to have to take some out anyway for the move as you start forming your curve. And I'm going to take my soldering iron over here, and I'm going to take some solder. Again, probably not a good idea to do this over foam. I would put some barrier down if I cared about this foam at all. Going to solder the points, outside points. I wouldn't do inside points because it can cause derails, but if you have to, make sure it's not touching the head of the rail. This solder being shiny is an indication that it's working correctly. Gonna wait for that to sit a minute. Just about a second actually. Solder cools off incredibly fast. Me blowing on it is kind of comical, but now I'm going to pull to make sure those joints are good because of that issue with the coating. And now we can work this into our curve. So now I've got the track in its rough form. You want to use your center line of your cork as a guide because you used your trammel points to make sure this cork had a nice 30-degree sweep or whatever the degree sweep is going to be on your layout. So you're just using this track alignment tool, twisting left or right to guide this track out and around your curve. Once that's done, is it perfect? No, absolutely not. This will save the day. I mentioned earlier that one thing that got on my nerves about micro engineering track just a little bit was the fact that the weathered rail needed to be filed down. You can use a Dremel or a file. Dremels go way faster to get the corners off down to the bare metal before you do any soldering. But the good thing about this track is it stays in the shape that you put it. You don't have to worry about it moving. You don't have to pin it down or anything like that. So it pretty much stays in the shape you put it. So I've got this track alignment gauge by Ribbon Rail. What I'm going to do is work it down into the track as soon as I find an area where I got the radius fairly right. So these come by radius, and this is 30. I've got one for my inner track, which is 27. So now that you got it snapped down into the rails, you run it. it's the first train on your layout. It's the first sweep of your track. As you can see, the track is conforming to this ribbon rail as it runs by. Get all the way across. What you're going to have is a nice, perfect 30-degree curve, or whatever the angle is. And when you're doing your track planning, I wouldn't suggest any weird oddball curves, because if you're going to use a tool like this, it only comes in even numbers. You know, a 26.15 inch curve is not going to be able to, something you're not going to be able to find in these. So anyway, it makes for just another check and balance to make sure that you've got the right radius, because these curves are very important. Any kinks, any variants, any S curves are going to cause a derailment. Once you have your track alignment gauge ran through your track, keep in mind when you're running it one direction, don't hold down the track in the other, because that will just straighten out that portion of track. If you're going to hold anything down, hold forward as you move your gauge. Now that that's done, you can see obviously where the solder points are. We're going to drop feeders there. If you have your track exactly where you want it, mark where these offset areas are so you can drill your holes for your feeders. Another thing to keep in mind is as you adjust the track, there are areas that will get ties closer together. I don't really have an area I can show you except for right up here, which is out of frame. So let me move this over. It's not very well lit, but you can see there's two ties together. You're just going to work them free of each other and start stretching it out. I use the back of a paintbrush. Use something that will separate them back to their already predetermined distances. So you got a big gap here and a lot of smaller gaps. You want to stretch it out till it's all covered. So that'll help you do that, but just keep in mind you want to run your alignment gauge one more time to make sure you didn't stretch your rail out and make a flat spot while doing that. That's about it for track placement, and you're going to, like I said, mark with a pen or something the areas where you're going to have your feeders, and you'll be able to then go ahead and move on to dropping your feeder lines, adhering your track, things like that. After you've laid your track, you're going to want to plan out your feeder wire drops. Now, feeder wires connect up to your bus line. Your bus line will go all the way around your layout delivering electricity, but your feeder wires will deliver that electricity up to the track. Now, what you want to shoot for is about every 3 feet have a feeder wire. I've kind of stretched out a little bit to about 3.5 or 4 feet on my layout, but as you can see here, I've went around and marked where the feeder wires are going to be. Then I took a drill using a 1/16 bit and drilled through 2 holes everywhere I marked. And then I took this 22 gauge wire. Yes, I have a band-aid because I've been really working on my layout here and killing my thumbs, but I took this 22 gauge wire and ran it through where all the drill holes are, and that leads us up to the next step in wiring. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about soldering your feeder lines that are going to eventually connect to your bus lines. So we've dropped our feeders. You're going to solder them now. Now you want to tin your wire, so bend it at a 90-degree angle, put some solder on it. That's all that tinning means, is you're putting solder on the wire. I've already got this one here in place. Got it up against the rail joiner, and all you're going to do is obviously you push it down under to position it under the joiner, and you add some solder to it. Once you've added the solder, let it cool for a moment, then you're going to give it a tug make sure it's a nice firm connection, and it's good to go. So that's all you do to actually connect your feeder lines, your feeder wire to the rail joiners. So I hope that explains how to lay track. Again, focusing mostly on curves. The straight tracks are very straightforward. You take off the ties just like you do on the curves, except you use rail joiners. You don't have to solder those points on the straights. So I didn't want to take much time in the video to show you how to do that. With that said, thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time right here on my channel. Take care.